Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Charlottesville, Confederate statues across the Commonwealth, photos of white students in blackface in yearbooks from Virginia institutions of higher learning, even Commonwealth leadership having to fess up, or not, to allegations of wearing blackface. Racism is certainly not new to Virginia, but how do voters really feel about race and racism in our Commonwealth? Students at Christopher Newport University decided to ask some questions. The results and how we can move the needle on race relations when we come back. Another View is next.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. First, let me begin by thanking all of you for the cards, letters, texts, flowers, prayers, and other expressions of support and condolence on the death of my mom. Ruby Eleanor Ham was a fantastic mom, wife, professional, and friend who loved the Lord and loved life. And now she is at peace, and it's up to me and the rest of my family to carry on her legacy of love and caring for others. I want to give a special thank you to producer Lisa Godley and audio engineer Todd Washburn for keeping things going here at Another View while I took care of business. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it so much. So after Governor Northam's blackface scandal, students at Christopher Newport University's Wason Center for Public Policy surveyed Virginia voters on their perceptions of race in the Commonwealth. Not surprisingly, there was not universal agreement, but the results are interesting. Here to unpack it all for us is Dr. Rachel Bitecofer, Assistant Director of the Wason Center for Public Policy at Christopher Newport University. Hello, Doctor.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you on the show. And Dr. Colita Nichols Fairfax, Professor in Social Sciences at Norfolk State University. Hello there.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great.
Thanks so much for being here. So, Rachel, I want to start with you. First, give us some background in terms of who were these students who did this study? And who did they talk to? Give us a kind of set the stage for us before we get into the results.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so we're very fortunate that we have a student-run survey research lab at Christopher University in the Wason Center, and so our students are employed there through the university and through the Wason Center. They work on numerous projects, so this is just one of many that they dialed on and collected data on for the academic year last year. It's a professional staff. They're trained.
So people come to you and say, we want you to do a survey on X?
Well,
is that how they get their information?
No, most of the survey work that my colleague and I, Quentin Kidd, do, we come up with. So it's internal, right? We don't do a lot of client surveys because we're an academic nonprofit. So we do work that's generally focused on Virginia politics or public policy, and Quentin and I come up with the surveys. And this, too, is an example of that. I knew I wanted to pull the issue of race, especially with the 400th anniversary. It already had been percolating in my brain, and then of course the blackface scandal hit, and the way the national media of course treated that was very superficial. It was about capturing the headlines and being able to say, oh, the top three are in this scandal, and be able to get clicks. But it's a very serious issue, and it ties into a very serious legacy, right? Not just for Virginia but for other southern states. So I wanted to give it the treatment it deserved, a very deep dive. And that students in the lab, their job in this process is to actually administer the survey. They run a state-of-the-art gold standard survey research lab. It's completely student-run, and they collect the data.
Okay, and who did they talk to?
So the surveys are structured so that it is, designed to get a scientific random probability sample. So in the case of this survey and most of our surveys, they're doing a random sample of Virginia voters.
Voters, okay. So they were all voters. And for the most part, I mean, things broke down according to party line. They broke down according to age. They broke down in a lot of different ways. And the topics that you covered, let's start with blackface, since that's the one that seemed to have a lot of interest in terms of the questions that you asked. And I guess my question for that one. Trying to find where exactly what it said. Oh, okay. So 85% of the people said that they'd never known anyone or had ever done blackface in themselves. 13% said that they had. Is that true? I mean, do you think those numbers are correct?
So this reflects what the national outlets that came into the state found. I think theirs was 11, and with margins of error that's statistically indistinguishable. My question was structured to allow additional things, and that was based on what I saw in the media. So during the time period of the scandal, the couple of weeks around it, we saw stories about college fraternities and sororities that did things like slave auctions that, definitely have racial undertones or other things like that. So I wanted to try to open it up beyond just, the actual act of putting black makeup on your face. I don't know that I achieved what I was going for with my question. I did structure it to say, have you ever painted your face with black makeup as part of a costume? To include a Halloween costume, but then I also went on to say in the question, or taken part in an activity that, looking back, you feel now might have been seen as racially insensitive. And I think I think that the 13% is probably an underestimation of that.
I think people would be embarrassed to admit that they may have participated or otherwise not want to, for whatever reason, let a survey know.
Well, so we actually had a very interesting conversation about this the other day, and I think this is probably the right take. I think it's actually more, and this, by the way, just for important context, this is a question only asked of white respondents.
Okay?
So I think it's probably more that many people don't think of things as racially insensitive unless I was to go on and explain to them some examples of things. And the reason is, as we were opining on a different conversation, is that a lot of this stuff is so institutionalized. Keep in mind, in the 1980s, like Eastern Virginia Medical School, it was so common that it didn't raise red flags for whoever put that yearbook together to the editor process, the school itself, to put this yearbook out with, students engaging and dressing up in Ku Klux Klan outfits and in blackface. I mean, this was so typical that it didn't raise eyebrows, right?
In the 1980s.
In the 1980s. So I think much of what might have jogged somebody's memory, it was just the norm of how things were. And I think that is in of itself part of what we need to be having a conversation about is, that change, and it's a healthy change for us as a collective society to take a second and say, wow, it was so normalized that it wasn't that remarkable that Ralph Northam and his friend may have engaged in this activity and put it in a yearbook.
Even going with your theory, Dr. Fairfax, from an African American perspective and also from an HBCU perspective, wouldn't we want people in 2019 to have recognized, even if it was the norm, that this was wrong? Yes. And so the conversation of, well, it was so normal, I just didn't think of it. I guess my question is, at what point does the mind make that switch?
Right.
What do you think?
The mind is not going to make that switch, because the reality is America really is a race-based country. And so we can love America and not like America. America has sponsored and endorsed race-based policy. And so I know that we tend to only talk about race relations with regards to interpersonal interactions. But the reality is policies have been passed and enacted and passed for the entire time America has existed. And race-specific or race-based policy impacts quality of life issues like nothing else. And so, in other words, if we lived in a country where race wasn't an issue, it would matter how Jimmy treated me, if Jimmy's white, if the policies were aligned, fair, distributable, equitable.
So on an individual basis, it wouldn't
Right.
make a difference
Exactly.
if the policies were
Exactly.
straight. I'm curious from your experience on NSU's campus and just dealing in HBCUs in general, what was the feedback about blackface on campus?
My students were not surprised because one of their interactions in society, and two, many of my students have experienced poverty, have experienced police brutality and indifference. My students have experienced differential treatment within employment sectors. Employment discrimination is very real. We don't talk about that, but that's another way that you assert a racial nation. My students have witnessed how their fathers or some other men in their communities are treated through the child support enforcement program, which goes after poor men and undermines the relationships between poor men and poor women who may have worked out a way to care for families, but will go after poor men. The way that TANF may go after poor women, and we don't talk about that. We talk about mass incarceration, which is a huge problem, but we don't talk about public welfare policies that are enacted racially and disparately against black folk. So what I'm trying to say is the way in which policy, which I argue are race-based, will treat black folk differently once implemented versus other communities. And now we're dealing with decades of how these policies are enacted in black communities. It's funny, we're talking about 2019 as the 400th recognition of the landing of African people at Point Comfort, present-day Hampton. They came in as captives, and although Virginia did not, colonial Virginia did not enforce enslavement statutes until 1660, 1661, the reality is those persons came in, they were not free.
Right.
Maybe only one or two were indentured, but they were not free. They had no rights. How do I make this assertion? Even on muster lists, their names are not even written. They are regarded as Negroes. They may not even be regarded as that. And so we need to come to terms that America has always been a racial nation. We can talk about 1619. We can talk about the Civil War. We can talk about Reconstruction, which walked back this whole promise of everybody living equally on one terms. We can talk about urban renewal. Urban renewal is another race-based policy. Listen, we travel I-64, do we not? Those of us who live in Hampton Roads. I-64 cut through the black community in my hometown of Richmond, cut through a notable black community in Hampton called Old Northampton, just divided physically that community. Cut through 264 around Norfolk, cut through an old, wonderful black established neighborhood in Berkeley. And so the reality is policies impact quality of life. They are real, they are racial, and until we really deal with the raciality of policy and economic parity, yes, people will continue to
do
believe.
what they do.
Absolutely.
Rachel, was there anything that surprised you out of the survey?
Yeah, and actually it ties really nicely, I think, into something that occurred to me as I was listening to Colita's response there, because she's absolutely right. We have this massive structural institutional racist system that was built in a racist fashion and is designed to reinforce it basically at every level, right? And in ways that often don't get discussed. So she's right. We pay a lot of attention to the incarceration and the police issues, but we don't spend enough attention on TANF and the social welfare system, which is very similarly structured, and probably ultimately is the causal basis of what leads up to that mass incarceration stuff.
TANF, for those who don't know what it is food stamps. I mean, right.
Temporary assistance to needy families. So it is.
I couldn't remember what the acronym stood for.
Yeah, it is
but it's the basics.
And it's a system, by the way, that was revised in the 90s as part of Bill Clinton's outreach to Republicans to become more racist and more systematically discriminatory against African Americans.
The welfare queen.
So, but I digress. The reason I mention that is because here, to take it back to this disconnect that white folks feel between racism and themselves, is that they are They are unwilling to take personal ownership of racism or acts that are racially insensitive, as we can see here in this data. But when we flip over to the surprising finding, for me, the surprising finding was that so many, and across the spectrum, because everything is bifurcated these days by race and by party, and everyone who knows me well knows that that's my shtick, okay? But yet, when I asked voters, and I was very careful in my wording, I didn't say is a problem. I wanted to make sure a significant problem. So the question says, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Racism is still a significant problem in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I was surprised that actually so many people agreed with this. I mean, it's 76% agree, 46% of them strongly agree. And when we break that down by party, it's, the vast majority of Republicans, 61% are in the agreeance camp. When we look at
61% of
Republicans agree with that statement. Okay?
Wow.
And when we look at white respondents, that's 72% of white respondents willing to say that racism is a significant problem. Okay.
Wow.
So talk about disconnect. They are willing to acknowledge the institutional problem with broad consensus. But boy, when it gets down to the personal as political, not me. And I think, as being the only member of the white community in the room, I'm in a lot of white-only circles too. You hear this all the time. You'll hear white people say things that are racist. And then they'll follow it with, but I'm not racist. Exactly. And you're like, no, dude, you are racist. That's a racist thing to say.
Well, just so you know, because I spend a lot of times in white communities also, and it's almost sometimes like I'm not in the room because they will say things sometimes, and
That's
I'll go,
shocking,
really?
Right?
And then they okay, Barbara's here. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Have you had a chance to take a look at this survey? What are you thinking about the results that we're talking about? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Matt joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Matt. You're on the air.
Hi there. The survey, of course, provides pretty troubling results in some ways, although the widespread recognition of the problem is a good thing. I want to go out into the weeds a little bit. Surveys are based on inferential statistics, and they're very powerful, obviously, when they're well conducted, and that's my question. Is in today's age, one of the primary fundamental assumptions in surveys and the application of inferential statistics are random samples. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how in today's world you get a random sample when cell phones typically aren't the numbers that people call, and lots of people won't participate in surveys and so forth. So I'm wondering how you deal with that statistically.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt, for the call.
And
Rachel?
I promise I didn't set Matt up to call so that I could brag on my Quentin and I's gold standard survey methodology. But boy, thanks, man. I'm glad you asked that question because, I do take very seriously this question. And there is so much work out there today that I feel should be better. Okay. So let me talk about why you can take pretty confidently, given the limitations of statistical inference that Matt alluded to, the Wason Center methodology. We do sample cell phones. In fact, 70-ish% of each of our surveys is going to come from cell phone sampling. It behooves a survey research company to do that. Because,
at this point, that's pretty much what people are using.
Yeah, I have not had a landline in 20 years myself, personally. I'm in that 40 and under crowd. So, we are doing voter surveys, generally speaking. And so our random sample comes from registered voter files. Okay. If we were doing adults of Virginia, we would sample differently. But we're doing voters, so our random probability samples draw from that initial sample file. And then, our N sizes are robust so that we can lower what's, that margin of error issue that we see in a lot of these surveys out in the market today are too small in their N size. Here we're talking about over 1,000 surveys. So, given that, that said, no matter how good you are at it, the limits of statistics, put in design effect and margin of error. So when we're looking at a question like this racism question, the margin of error is plus or minus 3 points. So it really leaves no room to wonder. We can say with a lot of statistical, about 95% statistical confidence, that the views of Virginians statewide, registered voters anyway, not all Virginian adults, but registered voters, is that about 76, somewhere maybe up to 79, down to 73% of Virginians feel that racism is a significant problem. But when we get down to this next question, I'm sure we're going to, which is this Confederate leaders question, really what we can say is that, it's basically a tie. Half of Virginia voters think they should come down or think that we shouldn't be praising Confederate leaders, and half think that we should.
Tell us the exact question that you asked
so
and
that
how it broke down.
In your opinion, is it still appropriate for public officials today to praise Confederate leaders? And when we're looking at that, that's a 48-45%, breakdown between yes and no. And, with that margin of error factored in, it could mean that as high as 51% say that we should, or it could mean as low as 45% say we should. And those margin of errors they're a mathematical fact, right? So a lot of times the things that are generating concerns, like our callers' concerns, is the way the media talks about surveys. They like to talk about them as facts, especially horse race polling. So when we get a survey and it says, Northam's up 52, 48, the media reports that as a fact. Okay?
And they're not looking at the margin of error.
And when Quentin and I report that out in our survey report, we're very clear. It could mean Ralph Northam's up at 55 or down at 49, but the media never talks about it like that, right? And so the public doesn't hear it like that either. But yes, I always urge people with survey research of any type, go straight to the methodology section, make sure they're looking at a mix of landlines and cell phones. I mean, some of the online polling is not random probability polling, generally speaking, because people are opting into panels to be emailed at. But there are some of the better resourced polling organizations are now finding a way around that by giving lower income households free internet and free computers so that they can be included into the pools and what have you. But yeah, methodology matters a lot in surveys.
Colita, I saw you shaking your head yes on methodology and on...
Well, I agree. I think that when you're a researcher, you want to make sure you ask the questions that's going to really get at the root of what you're looking for, and then to make sure that you are reaching a wide population to pull a sample from. So I absolutely support Rachel. What continues to irritate and anger Black folk, and I think justifiably so, is that there's a great deal of talking, but not a great deal of enactment of policy and institutional fairness. And it just gets old after a while.
So as Congress changes, as the Senate more slowly changes in terms of the look of who's in, do you think that at some point the laws then will start to, new laws will be enacted that will, and I'm asking this as I'm thinking about what's going on with the Roe v. Wade and kind of shaking my head no at the same time I'm asking this question. But how do we get to the point where institutionally we start to change things? Because it seems like if we're not making it happen on an interpersonal level, then, and we're saying that because laws are the way that they are, we're still being treated unfairly. Is it enough just to put people who don't look like white men in office to make changes, and will it ever change? What do you think?
I don't think we're going to see any change, and that maybe our children and grandchildren will see change, but it's going to take a huge push to change institutions
because it's so deeply embedded.
Absolutely. And then there's a lack of historical empathy, a lack of historical justice.
Well, that's a really good point too.
Yes, especially with the way in which school curriculum is taught. And school curriculums across the country are politicized. I don't care what anybody says. They are politicized. And so you get a little bit of snippet here, a little bit of snippet there of history. Our children are not learning about 1619 or not learning about other forms. They learn a little bit about Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Dr. King, and that's it.
Yep.
They don't really learn about Reconstruction. They don't really learn about some of the challenges in the 20th century. So there is a lack of historical empathy. What people suggest is, look, enslavement is over, and so what are you all griping about?
Exactly. Get over it.
Right, not understanding that people may have been emancipated, but they were not free, because Reconstruction took away all of that. Employment discrimination, the way in which debt peonage was used, and sharecropping, the ways in which segregation was used in the North. And we tend to let the northern states off the hook, but they were complicit in the regulation, suppression, and subjugation of black people. So this is a nationwide issue of race.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the results of the survey on race in Virginia, conducted by students with the Wason Center for Public Policy at Christopher Newport University. My guests are Dr. Rachel Bitecofer, Director of CNU's Wason Center, Assistant Director of CNU's Wason Center for Public Policy, and Dr. Colita Nichols, Fairfax Professor and Social Scientist at Norfolk State University. I want to talk about that next question because Dr. Fairfax led into it beautifully, which is the whole question that you asked about the Civil War. Read the question and then tell us the answers.
Yeah, and the beautiful serve up tennis serve she gave us is about the students, and I'll expand on that in a little after I talk about this specifically, but about how students don't get equal education, or the books are politicized. And so when we look at this, that is certainly a factor of this question, and it was something I was intending to measure with the question. So I wanted to get a sense here in Virginia how well people are able to identify slavery as the main cause of the Civil War. That is the main cause of the Civil War. Certainly there are states' rights issues, and certainly slavery by extension is a states' rights issue, but the Civil War is sparked and fought over the issue of slavery. And having done, been educated both out on the West Coast and in the Deep South was where I did my PhD. This is something that you, if you're teaching in the Deep South, you become aware. This is, a very big, heated issue in public education in the South. So I wanted to see where's the Commonwealth on this. Okay. All right, so the question says, to the best of your knowledge, what was the main cause of the Civil War? Would you say it was mainly about states' rights or slavery? And the way the Commonwealth shakes out on this is 51% slavery, 40% states' rights. So with that margin of error factored in for Matt, what that means is we can say with confidence the majority, or at least the plurality of Virginian voters, are able to identify states' rights slavery appropriately as the cause. But and I want to also condition this in saying that the Pew Research Center did a big national survey, and the Commonwealth, being a former Confederacy state, actually fares reasonably well compared to other Confederate states, certainly, but even nationally on this issue, which means actually not that Virginia's great, it means that the whole country has a problem, okay? Exactly. Let me be clear with that. Not that Virginia's great, that the whole country has a problem. And the way that you can tell that is by looking at these crosstabs, the region crosstabs, because where that problem is getting fixed is in Northern Virginia, where the political control of the school curriculum is revised. The textbooks were controlled by the old system, coming, through the segregated, control of the state, and that really emphasized states' rights. And during, as Nova had its political revolution and became a liberal and progressive, bastion, the school boards became progressive, and one of the things that they did was they got rid of those old Southern narratives out of the textbooks, and they changed that to say slavery is the issue. Okay. And you can see that, boom, I mean, just really stand out here in the data, because Northern Virginia and Richmond, who are both having these progressive intellectual renaissances, 58% of the people there are able to identify slavery as the appropriate cause. And then when you compare that to Hampton Roads and the Southwest, that number comes way down. That's also a function of higher rates of college-educated adults for those two regions versus Hampton Roads and the Southwest.
So let me give you some pushback. So everybody says that Hampton Roads is supposed to be so cosmopolitan and so progressive because we have people from all over the world who come and live here because of the military and the numerous institutions of higher learning, etc. But yet we aren't in the higher numbers in terms of the cause of the Civil War?
No, ma'am.
Okay, what's your theory behind that?
It's college education. There's two regions of the state that have higher than average or drive the higher than average college education rates for Virginia, which is, by the way, why Virginia is different than the other southern states politically. And those two regions are Richmond proper, which is what this region is. It's not expanded to and also it contained the more urban or rural areas around it. We have a separate region for that.
Okay.
And Northern Virginia. So those two areas have extremely high rates of college education, and that's what's driving that.
Wow. What do you think?
Oh, I agree with her
with
regards to the statistical breakdown of populations. Also, Hampton Roads is still really rural. So unless you really live in the cities, the 7 cities proper, Hampton Roads is still quite rural.
So what do we believe here in Hampton Roads? What were our numbers?
All right, so in Hampton Roads is a statistical tie.
Okay.
46% say states' rights and 45% say slavery. And, we had a pretty good, I'm afraid to answer that question, constant rate of around 10%. So Hampton Roads is 9 on that. So people who were too afraid to answer.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Those are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about the Wason Center survey on race in Virginia. And James joins us from Hampton. Hi, James. You're on the air.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I appreciate the conversation. It's pretty good. Going pretty well.
Thank you.
My comment, I want to take it back to an earlier survey question that was mentioned about Republicans and Democrats at the voting polls being polled for if they think racism is still a significant issue in Virginia, in the Commonwealth. And she was reporting that the results are, people are acknowledging, so many people agreed that it surprised her that they're acknowledging that there's institutional racism and things like that. But the way the question is worded is actually pretty broad. And I would agree with that question if I were to take in the survey, which I do like to take surveys. But my reasoning wouldn't be because I know a whole lot of racist people, and I think that there's a bunch of racist people still. It's because we're having so much conversations about it these days. That's why I would think it was a significant issue. And there could be so many other reasons why people would agree with that statement that have nothing to do with agreeing that we have this mass institutionalized thing going on. Now, granted, I'm not saying there isn't, but that wouldn't be why I agreed with it.
All right, let's give Rachel a chance to respond. Thanks so much for the call, James. We appreciate it.
Yeah, James makes an excellent point. This question, if I had asked it maybe now or even 3 months from now, it may well not have ticked up as high because the issue was getting discussed a ton in the media because of the blackface scandal. And this is well documented in survey research. So like if you, for example, do a survey about gun control in the wake of a school shooting, you're going to have much higher, so salience is definitely a factor that's probably contributing a little bit to those numbers, as James points out. Good point, James.
All right. And Steve joins us from Yorktown. Hi, Steve. You're on the air.
Hi. Thanks for having me on today.
Sure.
I actually just had a quick question. As a amateur statistician, I guess I'd say, I have a question because I think there's something being portrayed a little bit off. When a sample size is taken from a collective group, the confidence level doesn't speak to the results of the numbers. In other words, 43% plus or minus 3% is either 40 or 46. The confidence level speaks to the confidence you have a representative sample. So you could have a 5% confidence level and the sample could be completely wrong. And that's kind of a common statistical problem with a lot of the statistician pieces that they use on the air. So I kind of wanted to either get the comment or the clarification on that. It doesn't speak to the number itself. It speaks to the confidence you have a representative sample in the size.
I'm talking about the margin of error when I talk about those spreads. So, it could be 46 or 49% or 43%, right? So that's a margin of error. You get that margin of error based on the level of confidence. So whatever you decide to set that at, here it's 95% or 5% conversely. But yes, there are two different distinct statistical concepts.
Go ahead.
So the last two calls we've just had is an example of the discussion of race and racism. Racism kills. Racism truncates quality of life issues. Racism can alter how you're able to save and protect your children, your husband, your wife. Racism impacts how you're able to care for your loved ones. Racism impacts every day of your life and your quality of life if you're an African American, but yet the calls are concerned with the stats as opposed to the real life issues that Black people deal with every day, which is what the study was about.
Yeah, that's where the frustration comes in, I think. Absolutely.
Well, stats are easy to talk about and race is difficult. Right?
Let's talk to Alicia in Virginia Beach. Hi, Alicia. You're in the air.
Hi. I love your show.
Thank you.
Yes. One way that I think that maybe we can start to heal and start to tame racism is by changing our curriculum in school. Right now, history is taught, I believe, mostly through the eyes of the victor. And perhaps we should make a push to teach history through the different groups that contributed to make this country what it is. Because we will probably always have some form of racism that's just part of human nature. But if people were to learn the truth and the contributions of every group, I believe that perhaps then we could start to heal. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much for the call. We appreciate that. Kind of goes to your point of what you were talking about before. I have a question for you, Rachel, about the so you asked two questions about the legal system. You asked about police brutality, or I'm paraphrasing now, but you asked about the police interaction with minorities, and you asked about the court's treatments of minorities. And so that kind of envelops the entire the process, if you will. And there was some surprising numbers out of there, I thought, in terms of which political party you were affiliated.
And I'd like to point out too, like the broad agreement that we see in those crosstabs between whites and Republicans and everybody else, at that broad, like 30,000 foot agreement that racism is a problem, it disappears when we start to talk about quantifying it in tangible ways, right? So, we need to acknowledge that. Like once we start asking people, okay, are African Americans treated fairly by the police? I mean, that one is a little bit different because I think it is harder. It's so much much in our face all the time, right? So you see a little bit less of a receding, effect for Republicans and for white voters there. Mm-hmm. But, in general, whites and Republicans, of course, conservatives would fall into that Republican camp pretty closely, do have a harder time being willing to say, this is how racism is manifesting. It's manifesting in the courts. It's manifesting in African Americans getting trailed around a store. You have to go shop. You have to go shopping with people of color to understand what it's like to shop as a person of color if you're white, right? I was just shopping a few days ago with my teen and his friends for the prom, and we separated for a bit in the store, and they got followed because he was with friends of color, and I was just so irritated by it, and you have to experience it in order to understand it. I don't live in that skin, so my irritation is fleeting. It's not something that I have to live with every day, right? So anyway, I digress. So what did people have a hard time? And
what did conservatives and whites say about being treated differently in the courts as opposed to others? So what were the numbers?
So let's look at this. Okay, so when we look at police, number one, when we look at the whole data, people are willing to admit, before we break it down into groups, we've got consensus, right?
Okay.
Police treat minorities differently than whites. We're looking at 65% in that agreement. We've got the courts treat minorities differently than whites. We've got 57% agreement. We have this one was one of those questions that is too hard for people. So minorities have a harder time getting loans and mortgages than whites, and I can tell it's too hard for people because the don't knows go up into the high teens. So keep that in mind here. But we see 52% in agreement. Minorities are treated differently than whites in the workplace. We go to 57% in agreement. Minorities are treated differently than whites in stores and restaurants, 51% agreement. And then minorities are treated differently than whites when voting in elections. That is only at 39% agreement. Okay.
But African Americans and people of color see that differently.
Yes,
according to your survey.
We separated people of color, African Americans and Latinos, because I wanted, now that Virginia's Latino population is growing, I wanted to be able to, ascertain if there were differences there. There really isn't. I think they're both experiencing the same phenomena. And then, there's white liberal Democrats behave exactly like minorities, and then white Republicans behave in a different way politically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Heather joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Heather. You're on the air.
Hi. Thank you. I applaud this informational, essential survey. Thank you so much for all this information about racism and race in Virginia. And I did want to comment that it does not take a college education to know that slavery is wrong. And I learned by age 6 in first grade, slavery of an entire race of people is wrong. It was public school education. We cannot afford willful, intentional ignorance that slavery is wrong, and that is why we fought a civil war, and that is why many, many people died on the battlefield, and Robert E. Lee had no right to turn his back on his country who paid for his West Point education to protect slave owners.
Okay, Heather, thanks so much. We know how emotional you get with this show. Thank you so much for your call. We appreciate it. But it brings out the fact that people on individual basis really take this to heart. Or not.
Yes. Oh, yes. This is
depending on where their plight is in life.
Yes. This is a heated issue. It is an uncomfortable issue. It can be uncomfortable even for people who consider themselves allies of the issue to discuss. So,
let's talk to Chuck in Chesapeake. Hi, Chuck. You're on the air.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I think I got a question. I don't know, but remember Black Wall Street, right?
Yes.
Now, why would white people burn and kill all those people on Black Wall Street because they wanted to be prosperous. And do you think that if that wouldn't have happened, Black people would have been a whole lot better off economically now? Be landowners, homeowners. Do you think that would have been?
Okay, Chuck, let Dr. Fairfax answer your question. But Colita, I'm going to ask you to explain Black Wall Street first.
So Black
that people
Wall
understand.
Absolutely. Black Wall Street was the name of a Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who really developed a very advanced, wealthy economic district at the end of the 19th century, well into the 20th century. And a race riot occurred, and that entire economic district was burned to the ground. Yeah. Black people were killed. Homes were burned to the ground. People just lost everything. There was just absolutely no recouping whatsoever in Oklahoma. And in fact, I believe the last living person who was a child during that terrible tragedy just died, I want to say last year. So Chuck is correct. We have Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have Rosewood. Mm-hmm. There are many situations where Black people build community after enslavement. That's what we had to do. We built community, and we had strong economic districts, and there were political and violent ways in which to nullify those districts. It is true that whenever we built for ourselves, that became a problem for people. And another example is lynching. Black men were not lynched just because there was this thought that they whistled or made some kind of statement to a white woman. It was often because they had property or businesses that people in power did not want them to have. So we have not on this show discussed the violence of racism. We've not on this show yet discussed the violent ways in which Black people have been regulated, suppressed, preyed upon. Racism is predatory. I know we just don't have time to unpack everything, but that is another aspect of racism that we don't talk about. The violence of racism, and it is connected with slavery, which was a violent institution. It's connected with what happened after Reconstruction, what happened to enact Jim Crow. It's violence perpetuated upon Black people because they are regarded as the cultural other, they're different, and they're subhuman, so people have a right to prey upon them because it's their fault that they even exist. So we haven't had a chance to really address the violence, predatory behavior of racism, but that is another aspect of why racism is such a problem.
So we've got like less than 2 minutes. Believe it or not, this timer has flown by.
Wow.
But so what I want to ask each of you to do is to just give our audience food for thought in terms of if someone were to come get your survey, what is the overall message you want them to take from it?
To take the data, look at the details of the data, and start conversations with their friends and family, especially if they happen to be white.
Okay, that's Dr. Rachel Bitecofer, Assistant Director of CNU's Wason Center for Public Policy and the author behind this survey. Thank you so very much for joining us. I appreciate it. And Dr. Fairfax, you have the last word.
Well, if you are a white person and you are not racist, then ask yourself if you've contributed to an HBCU. Ask yourself if you visited a Black church. Ask yourself what neighborhood do you live in? Is it predominantly white or Black? Ask yourself if you supported a Black business. Ask yourself if you've supported a Black agency. Ask yourself if you're concerned with poverty. Ask yourself who you voted for in the presidential election.
And with that is Dr. Colita Nichols Fairfax. She is a social scientist and professor at Norfolk State University. Ladies, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I know that we can continue on and on and on, and we shall as time goes on.
Well,
thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Essie Patha-Merkerson from Law and Order. You are listening to Another View.
See, Todd did that just for me because he knows Law & Order is my favorite show on the planet. It's a great welcome back gift. Thank you, Todd. It's called the Black Male Media Project, and the goal is to help change the narrative of how Black men are portrayed in news and in society. It started 2 years ago as the brainchild of the National Association of Black Journalists, and since then has been tackled through a series of workshops held by local chapters nationwide. One of those workshops will take place tomorrow at Norview Middle School. Our Lisa Godley looks at how Hampton Roads Black media professionals are working to create a fresh view of Black men here in this region.
Hampton Roads Black Media Professionals, or HRBMP, believes that one of the first steps to combating negative portrayals of Black men in the media is to start with open and honest conversations.
We don't see brothers like yourself that are coming to things like this to better themselves, to listen and discuss. But we see a counter message out there, that there's an agenda behind it. And what is that agenda? What is that agenda? And that's what we got to find. What is that agenda that they have? And then how do we destroy it?
That's why 3 years ago, HRBMP didn't hesitate when the National Association of Black Journalists announced the launch of the Black Male Media Project. Local President Ashley Christian Smith says this region was happy to be one of the chapters hosting a workshop and fostering such important discussions.
It's our responsibility to make sure that we are watching what's going on over the airwaves, what's being printed in our newspapers, what's happening in our community, and is it being painted in the correct light. Big responsibility of Hampton Roads Black Media Professionals and the National Association of Black Journalists.
I asked HRBMP Vice President Johnny Maples to share an example of how African American images are being used to foster negative portrayals.
Prime example, back in February, we had a discussion over in Hampton. There was an instance where a young lady was killed. Rather than report on how she was killed in the instance, they took a picture on her social media site, and she was talking on the telephone, but it looked like she was holding her cell phone up and it looked like a gun, rather than that elegant picture of her in a prom gown.
But changing the narrative delves deeper than challenging how media outlets portray African Americans, particularly Black men. It also looks at how young African American males see themselves and works to change mindsets.
You are very intelligent. You are very smart.
During the 2017 panel discussion, 13 News sports anchor Brian Smith spoke to young men and their parents about shifting the focus from sports to academics.
I have two grandsons who are 3 years old. I, for lack of a better term, mentally beat it in their heads. You're smart, you're intelligent. That's right. That's day to day. That's where it starts. It starts at home. Your kid stands a better chance of being a neurosurgeon like Dr. Myron Rolle now, former Florida State safety, than be in the NFL. That's a fact.
Combating the images that are already out there is just one arm of the Black Male Media Project. HRBMP also uses the workshop and panel discussion to inspire, train, and mentor young African Americans who currently work or aspire to work in media. I asked Johnny if he could speak directly to a young person who might not make this weekend's discussion, what words he would share that might help them rewrite their own narrative, and he was happy to do so.
Stay positive, stay motivated, and keep your eyes on what's happening around you.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And this year's panel discussion will begin promptly at 10 a.m. tomorrow at Norview Middle School in Norfolk, and all are invited to attend. Thank you for spending an hour of your life with us here at Another View. If you want to hear this show again or share it with a friend, please visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. And while you're there, please sign up for our eView newsletter, a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. We're on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Next time on Another View, and Another View history lesson on the historic First Baptist Church, Williamsburg, and the significance of the Freedom Bell. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Special thank you to Jonah Grinkowitz, producer of Hearsay with Kathy Lewis, for sitting in for Lisa Godley as producer of today's broadcast. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer, and Kamaria Mason answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a fabulous weekend, everyone, and thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.